He turned off every light, including his own engine. The crew froze. The sea went black. The only sound was the slow heartbeat of water against wood. Ahead of them, 3 Nazi ships patrolled the Bay of Biscay, their searchlights sweeping like white knives across the night. Each carried guns that could tear a PT boat in half with one hit. And somewhere in that darkness, Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley was smiling. "Engines off," he whispered. "Let them listen for ghosts." The crew obeyed, terrified. Their little wooden boat, 60 tons of plywood, 3 torpedoes and 12 men, drifted silently toward a fleet that outweighed them 50 to 1. No radar, no lights, no sound, only a captain's madness and the Black Sea ahead. The enemy didn't even know they were being hunted. Bulkley leaned over the compass, calculating by feel. The moonlight caught the faint scar on his cheek, a souvenir from another night like this. He tapped his watch once. 2 minutes, ready tubes, 1 and 2. His executive officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we're inside their range." Bulkley grinned. "Good. So are they." When the first torpedo hit, it split the night in half. The German escort erupted in flame. The others swung their guns toward the explosion, blind and confused. Before they could react, Bulkley's second torpedo struck home. Another fireball. Another ship burning. Then the searchlights found him. Tracer rounds shredded the water, slicing so close the spray felt like rain. Bulkley slammed the throttles forward. The 3 Packard engines screamed to life, their roar echoing like thunder. The PT boat leapt across the waves at 40 knots, zigzagging between columns of fire. A third torpedo launched, blind by instinct. Moments later, another explosion. The last enemy ship broke apart. When dawn came, 3 wrecks smoldered on the horizon. The Navy called it insanity. The enemy called it impossible. And somewhere in the smoking dawn, Bulkley just laughed. "Mad?" he said. "Only if it hadn't worked." That morning, the U.S. Navy's smallest ship had just written its loudest victory. War at sea had always been a contest of giants. Steel hulls, thick armor, and guns the size of train cars. Admirals believed in displacement, not daring. To them, the idea that a wooden patrol boat, 60 tons, barely longer than a tennis court, could sink a destroyer was laughable. Even within the U.S. Navy, the PT boat was treated as a curiosity. Crews called them plywood coffins, engineers called them experiments, the brass called them expendable. But Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley didn't see scrap. He saw potential. "Big ships make big targets," he liked to say. "We just have to be too small to hit." It was a heresy in a Navy built on tonnage. Power had always meant armor, not agility. Battleships were worshipped. Small craft were ignored. Bulkley rejected all of it. To him, war wasn't about the size of the ship. It was about the nerve of the man steering it. He began calling his squadron the Mosquito Fleet. They weren't there to fight fair. They were there to sting, vanish, and sting again. The PT boat, or patrol torpedo boat, carried 4 torpedoes and twin 50-caliber guns. Its hull was wood. Its engines were aircraft-grade Packards that burned aviation fuel at terrifying rates. A full-speed run could drain half a tank in 20 minutes, but it was fast, 41 knots fast. Faster than anything the Germans could field. And that speed wasn't just survival, it was stealth. At night, the PT's small radar profile vanished against the sea clutter. A single wave could hide it. Naval doctrine scoffed at the idea. "A mosquito cannot kill an elephant," one admiral remarked. Bulkley replied, "Maybe not, but it can drive him insane." He didn't believe in even fights. He believed in mathematics. If his boats could close the distance before being spotted, within 3 miles, their torpedoes had a 60% kill probability. A destroyer's gunners had 5 seconds to respond. The odds weren't equal, but they weren't impossible either. The misconception persisted because most officers had never seen a PT boat move at night. Engines idling, cutting through black water without a sound. Bulkley had. And in that quiet, he saw a future where speed and chaos could replace armor and mass. He wasn't defying the Navy's logic. He was rewriting it. The idea of a mosquito fleet was born not in an admiral's office, but in a small shipyard smelling of resin and gasoline. In 1941, the U.S. Navy was still clinging to its battleships, massive steel symbols of national pride. But a few rogue engineers believed the future of naval combat might come from something far smaller. They designed the patrol torpedo boat, 80 feet long, 60 tons, built entirely from laminated mahogany. No armor, no heavy guns. Just 3 Packard engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, and a handful of torpedoes that could sink a cruiser if they hit the right spot. It was a craft born out of desperation and ingenuity. The early PT boats were disasters. Their torpedoes often ran too shallow, engines overheated, and the wooden hulls cracked under stress. More than one officer called them suicide sleds. But Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley saw something no one else did: potential in the flaws. He began stripping unnecessary armor to lighten the hull, rewiring the fuel feeds to keep the engines running cooler, and teaching his crew to maintain every system by hand. He even replaced standard steel screws with experimental bronze ones that reduced wake noise by 12%. He wanted not just speed, but silence. When he took command of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2, his men thought he was unhinged. He drilled them at night without lights, forcing them to navigate by feel, compass, and moonlight. He made them memorize the hum of each engine so they could diagnose a problem by sound alone. To Bulkley, the sea wasn't chaos. It was an equation. Every wave has a rhythm, he'd say. Find it, and you disappear. His PT boats became ghosts. Impossible to track, impossible to hit. While the Navy still dismissed them as experiments, Bulkley's squadron started scoring victories. Small raids, then supply interceptions, then night strikes on convoys. When he presented his results, ships sunk, fuel saved, 0 losses, higher command didn't know what to make of him. Unofficial, they called it. Unverified. But by late 1943, he had the proof. A single PT boat operating independently could achieve the same kill ratio as a destroyer, at 1/50th the cost. The equation was brutal in its simplicity. Speed x stealth x nerve equals power. The Navy's traditionalists saw risk. Bulkley saw inevitability. He was building the future, one plank of mahogany and one midnight raid at a time. The fleet would later nickname his men the Madmen of the Channel. He preferred another title: Professionals who ran out of patience. Every admiral in the Atlantic Fleet knew the math. And according to that math, John D. Bulkley should have been dead. A German destroyer displaced 2,500 tons, carried 120mm cannons, anti-aircraft batteries, radar, and armor plating thicker than a man's arm. Its crew numbered more than 200. A PT boat weighed 60 tons and carried 12 men. Its armor? Half an inch of mahogany soaked in gasoline fumes. Its range? A few dozen miles before refueling. By every calculation, it wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight at all. But Bulkley didn't read the equations the way the admirals did. To him, a destroyer's strength was also its weakness. Its radar range depended on line of sight, a ship's height above water. The PT boat, skimming barely 6 feet off the surface, could hide beneath that line. Radar could detect a destroyer at 12 miles, but a PT boat at 4 or less. That meant he could close the gap unseen in under 5 minutes. At top speed, 41 knots, a PT could outrun a destroyer's turning arc by nearly 40%. A destroyer's main guns could fire 10 rounds per minute, but they couldn't depress low enough to hit a target smaller than 10 feet tall at close range. In that blind zone, Bulkley found survival. The numbers stacked against him, but they also revealed opportunity. He broke it down for his crew one night, chalking equations on the bulkhead. They've got 200 men, we've got 12. They've got radar, we've got nerves, they've got power, we've got angles. He calculated that if they attacked at a 45-degree approach, launched torpedoes within 3,000 yards and turned hard starboard, the German radar would lose lock for 7 seconds, long enough to escape. 7 seconds became the currency of survival. The Navy had spent years chasing supremacy through size. Bulkley found it in geometry. His men began calling their runs the math of imbalance. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, outarmored, but not outthought. When word of their success spread, analysts tried to model his tactics. None could explain them completely. The official report concluded, results inconsistent with predicted outcomes. Bulkley laughed when he read it. That's the point, he said. Predictions get you killed. Imbalance keeps you alive. By rewriting the numbers, he wasn't just surviving the war. He was changing what the Navy believed was possible. It was March 1944. The Bay of Biscay was calm, too calm. The kind of stillness that made even veterans uneasy. Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley stood on the bridge of PT-518, his hands tucked in the pockets of a grease-stained jacket. The wind smelled of diesel and salt. His crew watched the horizon, where German patrol ships prowled under a half-moon. Their orders were clear: patrol and report enemy movement. Nothing more. Bulkley tore up the orders. He pointed into the darkness. 3 contacts, 8 miles east. Let's go meet them. Sir, his XO warned, those are destroyers. We're supposed to stay clear. Bulkley grinned. We are staying clear. We'll pass right through them. He throttled down the engines until the hum became a whisper. The PT boat slid through the dark water like a shark beneath glass. Every light was off. Every man spoke in whispers. Even the radio was dead. Ahead, 3 German ships formed a patrol triangle, a perfect net of radar and firepower. Any other captain would have turned back. Bulkley accelerated. Engines idle, he said. We're ghosts now. The sea became black silence. The German ship's searchlights swept lazily across the water, each pass missing PT-518 by meters. Bulkley used his stopwatch, counting under his breath. 5 seconds per sweep. They're blind between intervals. He moved into the gap. At 3,000 yards, he ordered the first torpedo armed. Tube 1 ready, steady. The torpedoes slammed into the nearest destroyer midship. A wall of fire rose skyward, lighting the ocean in orange reflection. Tube 2, fire! The second torpedo streaked toward another ship. The explosion tore through its bow. The sea boiled with debris. The third destroyer reacted instantly, its 88mm guns opening fire. Shells rained around them, throwing columns of water into the sky. Bulkley slammed the throttles forward. The PT boat shot out of the fire like a bullet, skimming waves at 40 knots. Tracers zipped overhead, close enough to feel the heat. He turned hard, doubling back through the smoke. His gunner opened up with twin 50s, strafing the burning wrecks. The third torpedo fired blindly into the chaos. Seconds later, another explosion. The last German ship broke apart. The crew erupted, shouting, laughing, half in disbelief. 3 for 3, Bulkley said quietly. Now let's get home before they remember we exist. He cut his engines again, letting the burning wrecks illuminate their escape path. By dawn, PT-518 limped back to base, hull shredded, antennae gone, paint scorched black from near misses. When Bulkley reported in, the operations officer stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You went into their patrol zone alone? Not alone, Bulkley said. I had 12 men who forgot how to be afraid. Later that morning, British radar confirmed 3 enemy wrecks drifting in the bay. One officer muttered, "That's impossible. Those ships were unsinkable." Bulkley lit a cigarette and smiled. Then I suppose they died of imagination. By morning, the impossible had become undeniable. 3 German ships destroyed, no American losses, no aircraft support, no authorization. The Navy's reaction was split down the middle, awe and outrage in equal measure. On paper, Bulkley had broken nearly every regulation in the book, operating alone, violating radio silence, engaging superior forces without command approval. Any other officer would have faced court-martial. But the numbers refused to cooperate with the anger. 3 confirmed kills, 0 casualties, fuel expenditure, under 10%. A cost ratio so absurd it made admirals pause. The mad captain had turned arithmetic into artillery. Word spread through the fleet faster than official reports. PT crews began whispering about the Biscay equation. The formula was simple: speed, silence, and timing. The same tactics once called reckless were now being copied in every coastal theater. Naval Command didn't want to admit it, but they quietly issued a directive. PT units may exercise limited discretion under extreme conditions. That was bureaucratic code for, do what Bulkley did, just don't get caught. Within weeks, copycat raids erupted from the Channel to the Adriatic. German radar operators started calling the new enemy pattern ghost runs, small boats that appeared and vanished faster than sonar could track. The chain reaction wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Big ships began to hesitate near shorelines at night. Convoy routes shifted. German captains slowed their formations, afraid of invisible attackers in the dark. The cost of paranoia was measurable. Convoy efficiency dropped 22% across occupied waters that month. The U.S. Navy didn't win the Atlantic through brute force alone. It won through confusion, through the fear planted by a single wooden boat that shouldn't have survived the night. Bulkley's insanity had become strategy. He had proved that disobedience, when guided by precision, wasn't rebellion. It was innovation. The math of collapse wasn't about destruction. It was about momentum. One raid had broken the equations that ruled naval warfare. And once the numbers changed, nothing stayed still. After the Biscay raid, Bulkley didn't rest. He rebuilt. His PT boat was half crippled, engines coughing black smoke, paint scorched off from the heat of explosions. But instead of requesting repairs, he rolled up his sleeves and went to work. Speed isn't a setting, he told his crew. It's a state of mind. He tore apart his own engines one by one. The Packard mechanics at the dockyard thought he was insane. Each engine was a masterpiece of precision engineering. And here was a captain dismantling it with a wrench and a cigarette between his teeth. Bulkley's goal was simple: make the PT run faster, longer, and quieter, all at once. Impossible, according to everyone else. He experimented with dual fuel feeds, running aviation-grade gas through a secondary pressure line to reduce vapor lock at high RPMs. He replaced the exhaust baffles with custom aluminum tubing scavenged from crashed bombers. The modification cut the noise signature by 15 decibels, enough to disappear from sonar sweeps at night. Then came his most radical idea, a variable throttle linkage that let him shift between engines without losing torque. It allowed the PT boat to leap from 20 knots to 47 in seconds, faster than any ship its size in the entire Atlantic. During tests, mechanics watched in disbelief as PT-518 hit record speed across the harbor. The wake behind it folded into the fog and vanished. When an officer asked how he'd achieved it, Bulkley just smirked. I taught her to breathe between heartbeats. The Navy had spent millions developing radar and sonar. Bulkley countered with tuning forks, oil rags, and instinct. He didn't just modify a boat. He redesigned the relationship between man and machine. In the next mission, that relationship was tested again. A German E-boat spotted their convoy at night and closed fast, faster than any destroyer. The E-boat was Germany's answer to the PT, sleek, deadly, precise. But it wasn't fast enough. Bulkley throttled up his new system. The PT boat shot forward like a missile, engines roaring in synchronized rhythm. Within minutes, they were parallel to the E-boat, so close they could see the muzzle flashes of enemy guns. "Return fire!" Bulkley yelled. The deck guns opened up, tracers stitching the dark. One burst hit the E-boat's bridge. It veered, caught fire, and exploded. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. When they returned to base, a mechanic checked the throttle housing and shook his head. "You ran her past limits that don't exist." Bulkley grinned. "That's why they call it a limit. It's meant to be moved." He had turned speed into a philosophy, one that would soon reshape how the Navy thought about propulsion, agility, and combat timing. For the first time, the brass began to understand this wasn't madness. It was mastery disguised as chaos. 3 days after the raid, a courier arrived at the dockyard carrying a single envelope stamped "Confidential, Admiralty Review." Bulkley didn't open it. He already knew what it said. "Report to headquarters," he muttered, lighting a cigarette. "Looks like I finally get my ticket to the gallows." He'd defied 3 standing orders, risked his crew, and acted without command authority. The Navy had no tolerance for improvisation, at least not until it worked. When he walked into the temporary headquarters in Plymouth, the silence was heavy. A dozen officers sat behind a long table. At the center, a 2-star admiral leaned forward. "Commander Bulkley," he said slowly, "you led an unsanctioned raid into enemy territory?" "Yes, sir." "You engaged 3 enemy destroyers?" "Yes, sir." "And you returned without losses?" "Yes, sir." The admiral's jaw tightened. "You're aware that disobedience in wartime can be punished by dismissal, or worse." Bulkley exhaled smoke and nodded. "Then I'll accept that, right after you check the wreckage reports." The room stayed quiet. An aide handed the admiral a sheet of paper. Intercepted German transmissions confirming 3 lost ships in the Bay of Biscay. For a long moment, the admiral said nothing. Then he set the paper down and spoke softly. "Do you know what they're calling you in London, Commander?" Bulkley shook his head. "The Mad Captain," he half smiled. "Could be worse." The admiral leaned back in his chair. "You realize you've just rewritten half of naval doctrine?" Bulkley shrugged. "I wasn't trying to rewrite anything, sir. I was just trying not to die slow." Laughter broke the tension. 2 weeks later, the same admiral signed the citation that would award him the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition the Navy could give. The report described his actions as a calculated act of initiative under extreme risk. Unofficially, every officer knew what it really was: one man refusing to wait for permission to win. When the medal was pinned to his chest, a reporter asked if he considered himself reckless. Bulkley answered without hesitation, "Reckless men die for glory. I fight to stay alive. That's the difference." In the months that followed, naval engineers began visiting his squadron, studying his modifications, documenting his ghost tactics. They turned his madness into manuals, his improvisations into doctrine. The irony wasn't lost on him. "The same Navy that almost court-martialed me," he joked, "is now teaching kids how to break rules better." The courtroom that once threatened him had become the birthplace of modern fast-attack warfare. Sometimes victory doesn't need approval, just audacity. Courage, they said, was the ability to face fear. But for John D. Bulkley, courage was the ability to calculate it. He never saw madness in what he did, only numbers, timing, and the narrow gap between caution and death. To him, the difference between a hero and a fool was 2 seconds and a steady hand. Naval warfare had always been an equation of weight and distance. Bulkley turned it into one of motion and intent. His formula was brutal in its simplicity: speed, X silence, X nerve, il survival. Every mission he led followed that logic. Every risk he took balanced on a knife edge of data and instinct. His mind was half engineer, half gambler, and the sea rewarded both. By the end of 1944, his madness had infected the Navy. Patrol boat captains began running their own stealth operations. Destroyer commanders requested modified throttle systems based on his designs. Admirals who once laughed at the PT program now called it the sharp end of the fleet. Bulkley never claimed credit. He only said, "They finally learned what we already knew. Fear can't hit what it can't see." The numbers proved him right. His unit, operating on a fraction of the budget, achieved kill ratios rivaling heavy cruisers. Their missions cost less than 1% of what it took to deploy a battleship. Yet they crippled supply lines across entire coastlines. That was the math of audacity. The math that says a handful of men on a wooden boat can tilt the balance of an ocean. When asked years later if he ever regretted disobeying orders, Bulkley paused, then smiled. "Regret is for men who waited. I was busy moving." In the language of war, audacity isn't recklessness. It's acceleration. He didn't change the sea. He simply learned how to make it move faster for him. When the last patrol ended, the sea fell quiet again. But the legend didn't. John D. Bulkley's crew went home thinking they'd simply survived another mission. They didn't realize they had rewritten the tempo of modern naval warfare. In an age obsessed with fleets and factories, one man had proved that agility could outthink mass, that the ocean didn't care about tonnage, only nerve. He became the prototype for a new kind of commander, part mechanic, part mathematician, part madman. Every future fast attack craft, every missile corvette, every stealth boat that sliced through the waves carried echoes of his defiance. Because the math he left behind was timeless. A machine plus a man equals momentum. He aimed at empty sky and hit a plane he never saw. The crew thought he'd lost it. The enemy was still miles out, specks of black against the white glare of the clouds. No tracer, no contact, no sound. Just the distant hum of approaching engines. But Sergeant Harold Red Daniels didn't wait for sight. He trusted the numbers. He swung his twin .50 caliber Brownings up, not toward the fighters, but toward a patch of sky 10 degrees above them. Nothing but air. He squeezed the trigger. For a moment it looked insane, streams of bullets climbing into emptiness. Then the sky itself split. A German Bf-109 dove straight into the invisible wall of lead. It disintegrated mid-turn, fire curling through its wings before vanishing into the clouds. The waist gunners cheered. Daniels didn't. He just said, "They were already there. They just hadn't arrived yet." It was 1943, high above Bremen. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, was flying its 15th mission. The Luftwaffe was closing fast. 30 fighters against 20 B-17s. Every gunner in the formation was firing by instinct. Aim, track, fire, and missing. Except Daniels. He aimed at nothing and kept hitting everything. Later, the crew would swear he had some supernatural sense, some invisible sight. But it wasn't magic. It was math. The hard, ugly math of airspeed, distance, and delay. At 400 miles per hour, the enemy crossed 600 feet every second. A .50 caliber round took 4/10 of a second to travel that far. By the time your brain told your hands to fire, the target had already moved. The difference between life and death was 4/10 of a second. Daniels had learned to aim into the future. And that day, in the thin, freezing air over Germany, the sky filled with invisible equations, bullets drawing arcs where men hadn't yet arrived. When they landed, his gun barrels were white-hot and warped. His oxygen mask was frozen to his face. Someone asked him how he knew where to shoot. He smiled faintly. "You don't shoot at what's there. You shoot at what's coming." Every new gunner came to the war believing the same thing. Aim where you see the enemy, and pull the trigger. It was simple, human, and completely wrong. At 25,000 feet, instinct was suicide. The B-17 Flying Fortress moved at 180 miles per hour. The German fighters attacking it closed in at more than twice that speed. Between them, bullets hung in the air for less than half a second. But in that half second, the entire world shifted. What your eyes saw was already the past. The human brain couldn't process it fast enough. It wasn't built for three-dimensional motion at hundreds of miles per hour. So, early in the air war, American gunners did what felt natural. They aimed straight at the aircraft, charging them. Their tracers streaked across the sky like glowing threads, beautiful and useless. Hit rates hovered around 15%. Then came the shock of loss. Bomb groups returning with empty tail sections, blood frozen to aluminum floors. Crews realized that instinct, bravery, and even perfect reflexes weren't enough. They needed a new logic, something colder than courage. So engineers and mathematicians at Eglin Field started to study the problem. They filmed mock dogfights and charted bullet paths like equations. They found that by the time a gunner reacted to what he saw, the target had already moved 250 feet out of alignment. The solution was counterintuitive. Don't shoot at what's there. Shoot at where it will be. It became known as lead fire. In training, instructors told rookies to fire into empty sky, to trust the angles, not their eyes. Many refused at first. It felt insane. But slowly they saw the pattern. Bullets weren't chasing targets anymore. They were meeting them. As gunners learned the rhythm of the sky, the results began to change. Missions, once ending in massacre, started to come home intact. By spring 1943, hit probability had jumped from 18 to 60%. Not because of new guns or better planes, but because men had learned to abandon instinct. They stopped reacting to the present. They started predicting the future. And in that strange evolution, the B-17 became less like a plane, and more like a machine that could see ahead of time. The Boeing B-17 wasn't just an airplane. It was a city of aluminum that learned to defend itself. Each fortress carried 10 men and 13 Browning 50 caliber guns. Nose, tail, waist, top, belly. Every direction had steel and fire. But one bomber alone was still vulnerable. Against German fighters, it was like a single fortress surrounded by a sea of sharks. The true weapon wasn't the plane. It was the formation. By 1943, the 8th Air Force perfected a pattern called the combat box. 12 B-17s flew in staggered levels, wings overlapping like scales. Each gunner protected not just his own plane, but the next one beside him. Every gap in one field of fire was filled by another. It wasn't instinct. It was geometry at 25,000 feet. The combat box turned chaos into structure. Every gunner had an assigned quadrant: 10 o'clock high, 6 o'clock low, 3 o'clock flat. If everyone followed the math, no enemy could penetrate without crossing at least 3 guns' arcs. But the system had a flaw. The gunners still aimed like riflemen, at what they could see. Against fighters closing head-on at 400 mph, that was suicide. On early missions, the Luftwaffe exploited it perfectly. Bf-109s dove straight through the formation, too fast to track. Gunners fired instinctively and always a second too late. Dozens of fortresses went down. Crews started calling the raids aluminum rain. It wasn't until the bombers over Bremen and men like Harold "Red" Daniels that the pattern began to change. During debriefings, Daniels described his shots, how he fired before the enemy appeared. Commanders at first dismissed it as luck, but then gun camera footage proved it. His tracers intersected enemy flight paths at perfect angles. The B-17's defense suddenly made sense. Each gunner wasn't fighting his own battle there. He was one node in a predictive grid. When a fighter entered that grid, it was already flying into bullets. Mathematicians at Wright Field mapped it. The average Luftwaffe fighter spent 2.8 seconds inside a B-17 formation's effective kill zone. A gunner had to make a decision faster than the human brain could process sight. So they stopped relying on sight. They relied on timing. The flying fortress wasn't powerful because it had 13 guns. It was powerful because those guns worked like a single equation, each man solving his fraction of survival. From the ground, the formation looked like symmetry. From the cockpit of a German fighter, it looked like death waiting in a pattern. Every airman who stepped into a B-17 learned one brutal truth. Physics didn't care about courage. At 25,000 feet, the enemy came fast. faster than a heartbeat, faster than fear. A Bf-109 diving from above closed distance at nearly 400 miles per hour, about 600 feet per second. A 50 caliber bullet, leaving the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, took just under zero.4 seconds to reach that distance. In those 0.4 seconds, the fighter had already moved 250 feet. That meant every gunner who aimed at a target was already too late. The instructors at Eglin Field turned that into a mantra. By the time you see him, he's already gone. The math was merciless. The human eye could track about 12 frames of motion per second, but a closing enemy crossed a gunner's field of vision in less than half a second. Reflex was useless. The only answer was prediction. That's when the doctrine of lead fire became gospel. Instead of chasing the fighter's silhouette, gunners were taught to fire ahead of it, at the patch of sky where the aircraft would arrive by the time the bullets reached it. To most rookies, it felt like madness. "Why waste ammo shooting at nothing?" one trainee asked. "Because nothing is where the enemy lives," the instructor replied. The system was perfected through trial and data. At Wright Field, technicians filmed hundreds of mock engagements. They measured angles, speeds, bullet drift. They built mechanical predictors, analog computers that turned instinct into geometry. They found that aiming 10 degrees ahead at 300 yards yielded the best intercept rate. The result? Accuracy improved by 63%. But the most remarkable finding wasn't technical. It was psychological. Once gunners accepted that their eyes were lying, something changed. They stopped panicking. They started trusting rhythm, timing, intuition sharpened by numbers. Harold Red Daniels once explained it best. "If you wait to see fear, you're already dead. You've got to shoot before fear finds you." By mid-1943, bomber groups were returning home with fewer losses and fewer wasted rounds. The math had become instinct. The sky had become predictable. And somewhere between physics and faith, ordinary men learned how to kill with precision by aiming into the void. It wasn't luck. It was the science of seconds. July 25, 1943. The sky over Germany was the color of metal. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, was flying toward Bremen, one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in the Reich. 200 miles from the North Sea coast, radar alarms screamed across German bases. Fighters scrambled, black specks climbing fast to intercept the Silver Fortress formation. In the ball turret of B-17, Heaven Sent, Sergeant Harold Red Daniels locked his harness. The world spun beneath him, farmland, rivers, clouds. His turret turned like the barrel of a watch. At 10 o'clock high, sunlight flashed off a formation of Messerschmitts. They were coming head-on. The old rule said, "Aim for the nose." Daniels ignored it. He adjusted his guns 5 degrees forward, 3 degrees high. Empty sky, nothing there. "Red, what the hell are you shooting at?" the waist gunner yelled over the intercom. Daniels didn't answer. He fired a 2-second burst. The tracers arced out, rising into the bright void, and then, impossibly, connected. A Bf-109 dove straight through his invisible wall of lead. Its engine exploded in a flash of orange. The rest of the formation scattered. "Hit confirmed," the tail gunner shouted, disbelief in his voice. Another fighter swung around. Daniels tracked it, then shifted his sights a full body length ahead of its nose. Again, the space looked empty. He fired. The Messerschmitt flew directly into the stream and disintegrated. For the first time in weeks, the crew of Heaven Sent wasn't the hunted. They were the ones dictating the sky. Around them, other gunners began copying Daniels' rhythm. "Lead your fire," someone called over the radio. "Don't chase them. Meet them." Within minutes, the formation transformed. Instead of panicked bursts and wasted ammo, the air filled with invisible grids of fire. The German fighters dove into geometry and never came out. In the chaos, Daniels barely noticed the flak tearing around them. His oxygen hose froze solid. His gloves were stiff with frost. But his hands stayed steady on the triggers. Another attack wave. FW-190s this time, low and fast. Daniels didn't wait for the angle. He calculated the speed, the time, the lag, and fired before they even reached the formation. His tracers curved upward, invisible to the enemy until it was too late. 2 more kills confirmed. When they finally dropped their bombs and turned home, 6 B-17s were gone, but 20 German fighters had been shot down. In the debrief, commanders asked Daniels what changed. He shrugged. "I stopped aiming at what I feared. I aimed at what I knew." That mission became legend, not because of one man's skill, but because of the math behind his madness. From that day forward, the phrase "aim for nothing" spread through the 8th Air Force. It wasn't defeatist, it was prophetic. Because up there, at 25,000 feet, the only way to survive was to hit what hadn't happened yet. After Bremen, the numbers began to change, and so did the men. The 8th Air Force's analysts noticed something strange in the mission reports. Ammunition use was dropping, but kill ratios were climbing. Crews were firing less and hitting more. The brass called it statistical anomaly. The crews called it seeing ahead. Within weeks, the concept of predictive zone fire became official doctrine. It wasn't just a tactic. It was a mental shift. The gunners who survived longest no longer thought like hunters. They thought like engineers. Each had his own invisible map of the sky, an internal grid of angles, speeds, and probable paths. When a fighter appeared, their eyes no longer followed it. Their minds already knew where it would be. Sergeant Daniels described it best. At first you fight the plane, then you fight the pilot, then you fight the math, and when you finally trust the math, the fear goes away. The B-17 wasn't evolving mechanically, it was evolving psychologically. When formations tightened and men stopped wasting rounds, survival rates jumped. In late 1943, missions that once lost a quarter of their aircraft began returning with nearly all intact, and the change ran deeper than skill. It was an emotional collapse, the death of reflex. The war had trained young men to shoot at movement, to trust adrenaline. Now the fortress demanded the opposite: stillness, calculation, patience. For a gunner, that was hell. To sit inside a vibrating machine of death surrounded by smoke and noise and aim calmly into emptiness. But it worked. Each flight became a test of control, each trigger pull a mathematical prayer. By the end of 1943, Luftwaffe Fighter Command reported a doubling of aircraft losses over fortress formations, without understanding why. They thought the Americans had invented new guns. They hadn't. They'd invented a new way to think. In the skies above Europe, reflex had finally died, and prediction had taken its place. Florida, 1943. Eglin Field. The training hangar smelled of cordite and oil. Rows of gunnery simulators faced a white wall, curved like the inside of a dome. On it, shadows of German fighters flashed and vanished in seconds. Each student gunner had a mock turret, a replica of the B-17's 50-caliber system. The simulator projected moving silhouettes at random speeds and angles. The rule was simple. You had 1 second to react. Most rookies failed immediately. They tracked what they saw, not where it was going. Their tracers lagged behind, always a heartbeat too late. Then the instructors rewound the film. "Look again," one said. "That's not your target. That's where it was." The exercise became mechanical repetition. Day after day, men were taught to disconnect from instinct. The sky was no longer a scene. It was an equation. Harold "Red" Daniels, newly assigned as a training assistant after his first missions, stood beside the gunners and watched their frustration. He spoke softly. "Stop chasing ghosts. See the air ahead of the wings. That's where death hides." He reached over, adjusted a student's aim by an inch, a nothing adjustment, and pressed the trigger. The silhouette shattered. That moment, the entire room went quiet. The realization hit. The trick wasn't speed. It was prediction. Soon, instructors began calling it the geometry of survival. Each turret had a different math. Tail guns needed high-angle compensation. Ball turrets demanded parabolic projection. Top turrets relied on lateral offset. It was physics disguised as intuition. Daniels began sketching diagrams on scrap paper. Circles intersecting arcs, labeled with angles and distances. He showed that every attack path had a zone of arrival, a narrow cone in which every enemy fighter must appear. If you aimed for that cone, you didn't need reflexes, you needed rhythm. Within weeks, trainees began to change. Their movement slowed, their trigger discipline steadied. Fear gave way to calculation. For the first time, human reaction was syncing with mechanical prediction. One instructor wrote in his report, "These boys are learning to see seconds ahead. Their eyes move slower, but their minds move faster." By the time these gunners reached England, they weren't just soldiers. They were walking algorithms in flight jackets. Daniels called it the strangest kind of peace. In the turret, everything outside dies. There's no noise, no panic, just math and the shape of what's about to die. In that silence between seconds, a new kind of warfare was born. One where victory belonged not to the fastest hands, but to the calmest mind. October 14th, 1943. The second raid on Schweinfurt. The mission that every man in the 8th Air Force feared. Hundreds of B-17s lifted off from England before dawn, silver wings vanishing into cloud. Their target, Germany's ball-bearing factories, the beating heart of its war machine. By noon, they were flying through hell. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left, FW-190s from above, BF-110s from below, Me-109s head-on. Wave after wave of fighters tore through the formation. Inside the fortress heaven sent, Harold Red Daniels' world became smoke and motion. Flak bursts rocked the plane, peppering the fuselage with holes. His intercom crackled with screams. The top turret jammed. The tail gun was silent. And still he fired. He couldn't see the enemy anymore, and only flashes, shadows darting through clouds. So he relied on the one thing left. The geometry burned into his brain. He aimed at nothing. The tracers vanished into gray air. Seconds later, a German fighter appeared right where he'd aimed, already flying through his bullets. The FW-190 disintegrated. His oxygen mask froze. The feed lines in his turret cracked open. The air turned thin, and blackness crept at the edges of his vision. He kept firing. Below him, another B-17 exploded. The formation tightened, closing ranks around the gaps left by the dead. Daniels kept counting angles, adjusting by memory. The world slowed, or maybe he did. Every burst of fire was a calculation made in exhaustion. Two fighters came in from opposite sides, crossing paths. He didn't aim for either. He aimed for the space between them. When they converged, his tracers were already there. Both planes went down. When the oxygen finally failed, he slumped forward, still gripping the triggers. His last thought was a strange one. The sky looked calm again. When the fortress landed hours later, half its crew was unconscious from frostbite and hypoxia. Daniels had passed out mid-battle. The flight engineer found him still holding the controls, hands locked in rigor. His gun barrels were white from heat. His last burst had scored 2 confirmed kills. In the debrief, the surviving officers tried to make sense of it. How the hell did he keep hitting them blind? The answer was quiet, almost reverent. He didn't aim blind, one man said. He aimed by memory. That mission became legend. The day the 100th Bomb Group lost 60 bombers, but proved something the numbers had always known. You could take a man's sight, his oxygen, even his breath, but not the rhythm of his training. By the time the sun set over Schweinfurt, the sky was littered with burning planes. Some were German, some were American. All were victims of prediction. In the end, the B-17 didn't win the air war because it was invincible. It won because its gunners learned to fight what they couldn't see. The lesson was brutal. Vision lies, math doesn't. By late 1943, bomber crews across the 8th Air Force had stopped aiming by sight altogether. The new manuals no longer spoke about reflex or courage. They spoke about lead angles, closure rates, and predictive cones. What began as instinct became algorithm. The sky was no longer chaos. It was a problem to be solved, second by second, burst by burst. And the solution was invisible. Sergeant Harold Red Daniels never called himself a hero. He didn't have to. His training had made him part of something larger, a human machine calculating death in motion. He once said, "We didn't fight the enemy's planes. We fought their future." By trusting numbers over nerves, the B-17 crews rewrote aerial combat. Luftwaffe analysts later discovered that after predictive fire was introduced, fighter loss rates doubled, while American ammunition expenditure dropped by 37%. It wasn't magic. It was the math of the invisible. A weapon no radar could jam, no armor could block, no pilot could outfly. For the first time in human history, victory came not from reaction, but prediction. Those who survived learned an unsettling truth. You could only control the sky by letting go of what you could see. When Daniels was asked years later what it felt like, he paused and smiled. Like shooting into tomorrow and hoping you're still there when it arrives. In the cold air over Europe, that was enough. The fortress didn't just defend itself. It taught men to see seconds ahead of death. When the war ended, the sky fell silent, but the math remained. Thousands of airmen went home believing they'd simply been lucky. They hadn't. They had turned intuition into geometry and fear into precision. The B-17's legend wasn't built on armor or guns. It was built on prediction. Men like Harold Red Daniels didn't just aim at empty sky. They aimed at the future, and for a moment, they mastered it. That was the quiet victory. The one written not in medals, but in equations drawn in gun smoke. Because in the end, foresight was the deadliest weapon of the war.